Grand Rising, Cleveland, Ohio. Welcome to another edition of Open Door with Vince Robinson. I have very esteemed guests with me today. I have with me Macelle Mahala. She is the author of Black Theater, City Life, African American Art Institutions, and Urban Cultural Ecologies. And we're going to dive into exactly what that is all about. I also have with me Mr. Terrence Spivey. He is the founding artistic director of Powerful Long Ladder. And many of you may know that he's also making some inroads in Mobile, Alabama, and we'll talk about that as well. But first, I want to tell you about this fantastic book that is going to be available probably sometime within the next few weeks. It is a rich study of contemporary African American theater institutions, and it reveals how they reflect and shape the histories and cultural realities of their cities, arguing that the community in which a play is staged is as important to the work's meaning as the script or set. Mahala focuses on four cities' arts ecologies to shed new light on the unique relationship between performance and place. Cleveland, home to the oldest continuously operating Black theater in the country. Pittsburgh, birthplace of the legendary playwright August Wilson. San Francisco, a metropolis currently experiencing displacement of its Black population. And Atlanta, a city with 40 years of progressive Black leadership and reverse migration. Black Theater, City Life looks at Karamu House Theater, the August Wilson African American Cultural Center, Pittsburgh Playwrights Theater Company, the Lorraine Hansberry Theater, the African American Shakespeare Company, the Atlanta Black Theater Festival, and Kenny Leon's True Colors Theater Company to demonstrate how each organization articulates the cultural specificities, socio-political realities, and histories of African Americans. These companies have faced challenges that mirror the larger racial and economic disparities in arts funding and social practice in America, while their achievements exemplify such institutions' vital role in enacting an artistic practice that reflects the cultural backgrounds of their local communities. Timely, significant, and deeply researched, this book spotlights the artistic and civic import of Black theaters in American cities. With that, it brings me a great deal of pleasure to welcome to Open Door Sister Macelle Mahala and also Terrence Spivey. Welcome to Open Door.
Thank you. Thank you, Liz.
All right. Well, thank you for joining me. So I want to start with Macelle. You know, what prompted you to write this fantastic book?
Well, I am a African American theater historian. So I started on that path with my first book, which was on the Penumbra Theater Company, which is based in Minneapolis, St. Paul. That's where I'm from, and I worked at that theater for many years. The artistic director there, Lou Bellany, was my mentor, and still is. And so I really enjoyed looking at that company's history, how important it was, how unique it was. And after that book came out, I realized there are many, many other really important Black theater companies all around the United States, and these companies have not had their stories fully told in book-length works before. So I thought about that, and that's really what started me on the path of researching and what eventually became this book.
Okay, so where did you start? Did you start in Cleveland or did you start somewhere else?
Well, I live in California now, even though I'm originally from Minnesota. So I started in the Bay Area first, and I looked at, okay, how do the theaters in the Bay Area compare to, the theaters in Minneapolis? What are the things that they have in common, and what are the things that they have, the differences they have? And so that was, I wrote an article about that, and that was the beginning of this project.
Mm-hmm. And what were some of those similarities and differences?
In that particular case, a lot of it was about gentrification. So San Francisco is probably like maybe one of the, the cities that you most think of that has gone through this extreme gentrification and extreme, pushing out of Black and working class populations as it gets more and more expensive to live in the city. And Minneapolis hasn't had that extreme of a experience, but it has had some similar experiences where, like the Black community in St. Paul, when they built the freeway went right through the Black community, and the main thoroughfare was splintered, and the neighborhood was splintered because of that. So some city planning that it historically has negatively impacted Black communities has had an impact on both in Minneapolis and in San Francisco. So that's one similarity.
Okay. And let's dive into the reality of that, because you're drawing a correlation between theater and reality. So what role does theater play in bringing attention to this issue?
It plays many roles. So it could be the topic of the play. The topic of the play could be about, what's happening in those particular cities. So when I talked to Terrence, I interviewed him. I was really interested in hearing his experience about directing Objectively Reasonable, the community response to the murder of Tamir Rice. So that's an example of a play that is talking about what is happening in the community. And it's an opportunity for people to, come together and process and, talk about what's going on. Sometimes it's not necessarily about what's happening in the city itself. Maybe it's about experiences that resonate, historical plays, but they might have they might resonate in a particular way. Sometimes it's about like just the more mundane aspects of making theater. So in San Francisco, when rehearsal space is so expensive, how do you exist? How do you get rehearsal space? How do you put on a production in a city where the real estate is so expensive? So I talk about some of those, like the logistical parts of putting on a play and creating theater, and not just what's happening in the play that's being produced.
Okay, you brought up Objectively Reasonable, and I was privileged to see that production as well. Terrence, let me ask you, what prompted you to write that piece, knowing, as I know you, and you're very activist oriented in terms of your writing, but what prompted you to write that piece?
Well, actually, I was approached about a month or so after I left Caramel House. It had to be around March, April 2016. And Playwrights Local, David Todd and Tom Hayes, artistic director and manager director, approached me, and they happened to realize, oh, he's free. And so I met them at Starbucks. I'll never forget. It was a blank page, no script. And they mentioned that we're interested in you. We've seen how the works you've done. We see you're not afraid of putting certain works on stage. We would like you to put up a piece. And there's a long title, as was mentioned. I'm like, that's a pretty good long title there. And he said, you think we should cut it? I said, no, keep it. I love it. And they approached me and started gathering 5 or 6 other playwrights, including Mary Weems, Lisa Langford, Michael Oatman, David Todd himself, Tom Hayes. And they said, we're going to start going around. They're going to interview some of the people in the community. And I said, okay, is this going to be like a simplistic set? They said, yes. I said, I see what I want to take this already. I said, there's a lot of folks that are angry right now. And if I can't do what I want to do with it, I don't want to direct it. So what do you mean? I said, we have to allow art here in Cleveland to be able to speak out, because a lot of people who are, suffering in silence. I want to take it a feel of a Black arts movement, free Southern theater, all Black. They say, do whatever you want to do. I said, I'm sold, then I'll direct it. And that's how it came about. They approached me. Okay. These are 2 white guys now, Playwrights Local, small theater, only a year old. And the play was probably second full production, because the year before they were just doing stage readings.
Yes. So in the description of your book, you talk about the histories and the cultural realities. And in both cases, we definitely see that as a part of what you're talking about. Why do you think it's so important for us to have concerns about history and culture with theater as a vehicle?
Well, I think theater is a great medium because it's enjoyable. It's an enjoyable way to learn history, to learn about, the past and the present, how it impacts the present. The communal nature. I love theater because, it's people together in a room, right? It's that live component that you were talking about at the, a few minutes ago. Nothing can beat that, right? People we're social. I think the pandemic, proved this without a doubt, is that we really long to be together. We want to, come together and, have these collective experiences. And so that's, I think, the magic of theater and the beauty of theater. That's what theater can do as an art form that other art forms, can't do necessarily, or not in the same way anyway. I wanted to just add on a little bit to, so Objectively Reasonable is one example of how a theater can address, what's happening, right? It can act as a form of protest. It can act as a healing ritual. And I also wanted to talk about, when I was finishing the book, I went back to Cleveland and I looked at Karamu's production of Freedom on Juneteenth. And I thought that was a beautiful production, a beautiful example of how a theater company can react. So that was put together, I think, in a week, and the week after George Floyd was murdered. And it served as a healing and a way of processing that trauma that we were all experiencing. And I'll just, if you don't mind, I would like to just read a quote from the production that I include in my conclusion, if that's okay.
Okay.
So I watched it and it streamed it. So again, it's like theater adapting to the time. So it was a pandemic. We couldn't go into the theaters at that point. So it was rehearsed and then it was broadcast. It was live streamed. And so I watched it from my house in lockdown in California, and it really moved me, and it helped me personally. And also, I just thought it was a beautiful piece of theater. But this was one of the lines from the production that I thought was just great. It says, "We push along our creative hopes. This must be the medicine that melds our madness into memorial." So, I write in my book, I said, this production, it encompassed expressions of grief, pain, rage, hope, survival, resistance. It was just so powerful. And, the Tony Sias and, other people at Karamu collectively put that together because they saw it was needed. So that's another, I think, example of the power of theater and why these companies are so important, and telling the history of these companies is really important.
Yes, it definitely is power. I think that's one of the reasons why in some cases they go through extreme lengths to prevent us from having this power. We're going to talk about more in terms of the importance of theater and its relevance to our folks when we come back. You're listening to Open Door with Vince Robinson on 95.9 FM WOVU. My guests are Macelle Mahala, the author of Black Theater, City Life, African American Art Institutions and Cultural Ecologies, and Terrence Spivey, founding artistic director of Powerful Long Ladder. We'll be back with more right after this. Welcome back to Open Door with Vince Robinson. My guests this morning are Macelle Mahala, author of Black Theater, City Life, African American Art Institutions and Urban Cultural Ecologies, and Terrence Spivey, founding artistic director of Powerful Long Ladder. We're talking about this book, and we are talking about all things theater. We are really blessed in Cleveland to have Karamu, but we also have a movement in that there are directors and playwrights such as Terrence and his colleagues that are just turning out works. I mean, Mary Weems, for instance, it seems like she writes a play every week, Terrence.
Yes.
She's full of energy,
Yes.
full of ideas. And I watched her play last night and I was just amazed at what came out of that work. And I know that you probably have things in the works as well. Macelle, you spoke of Cleveland and Karamu House, but you also dealt with others. Let's talk about Pittsburgh and Atlanta. What were your observations about those theatrical institutions and the ecologies of those cities?
Pittsburgh is a really interesting city, and the sort of practice of Black theater in Pittsburgh is really influenced by August Wilson and August Wilson's legacy. I met August Wilson when I was a student. He came to Penumbra. He worked at Penumbra in the late 70s and 80s. So it was interesting. I had the privilege of meeting him and working on a few of his shows. So it was interesting to go to his hometown and to see how the theater's there. He was really a mentor to many, many people in Pittsburgh, friend and mentor. And the theater is still growing strong there. And there's, I talked to Mark Clayton Suthers, who's the founder and artistic director of Pittsburgh Playwrights Theater. And it was wonderful talking with him and talking about the history of his company. He did several productions, site-specific productions in the Hill District where August Wilson grew up. And so he did, for example, Seven Guitars is set in the backyard of August Wilson's childhood home. And they did a production that took place in the backyard of his childhood home, which is now a museum. And so things like that, where it's just, it was just really unique. And the way that they honored August Wilson and were kind of building upon his legacy while honoring him was, I think, the most significant thing that I took away from looking at those theater companies.
Okay. I know that Terrence happens to be a huge fan of August Wilson's. Thanks to Terrence, I actually participated in one of my first stage readings. I was in Ma Rainey's Black Bottom, and I saw the film, and I'm like, yeah, this is what Terrence did. Even though it was a stage reading, it just meant more to me. Terrence, what do you think it is about August Wilson that resonates so much with theaters and actors and those in that realm?
What is interesting, I'm here in Mobile now, and I'm actually using some of his works as for character analysis and scene analysis, and just to introduce August Wilson and Black theater and period to a lot of the folks here, because there's no Black theater at all in Mobile, Alabama. I think what it resonates is he's able to make the lowest, I wouldn't say lowest common, but a garbage man a gigantic character. I mean, he's about Troy Maxson, the man that somebody we would normally just drive by and pass by and won't even pay attention, but you're paying all this money to go watch him on stage give out his life, his passion, and his heart. His works, not only that, it chronicles really a history of our lives. I mean, all the 10 plays he's written, something there we all can relate to, from Jim of the Ocean up to Radio Golf, which is about gentrification, which is going on now, And on top of that, for me, I like the fact that he honors those before him, which I honor, like Ed Bullins and Leroy Jones, Amir Baraka, and I love the blues, and that's one of his big influences as well. But it's the everyday man, everyday Black man, or everyday man, because he's so universal. I think that really appeals to people, and it's the language too.
Yes. So Macelle, looking at Pittsburgh and just having the conversation that we've had about August Wilson, what kind of impact do you see his works and the theater community in general having on that city?
I don't think you can overestimate it. I think the impact is huge. They built a gigantic art center, which is not theater. It has a theater, but it's got a visual art component. They bring in dance, they bring in music, they have a jazz component, they have a film festival. So his legacy and people that had worked with him, like Salahuddin, worked really hard to create an arts institution that was well funded and supported by the city of Pittsburgh in his honor, named after him, to really celebrate Black culture and from a variety of different art areas, not just theater. So that definitely wouldn't have happened without August Wilson. And that was really beautiful to see too. I went and visited there and looked at some of the visual art exhibitions that they had there. So I don't think you can really overestimate like the impact of his legacy on the kind of arts community of Pittsburgh.
Here in Cleveland, we are very much concerned about the funding that's available to arts. And I know that there are many politicians who really don't fully understand the economic impact that the arts have on communities. And as a result, you don't really see any direct support for artists when it comes to that. We have had someone within the city's administration who had a very small lane, and it just so happens that this was someone who was involved in theater. But for the most part, it was just theater productions that involved children and not anything on a large scale. And again, there was no direct funding for artists in Cleveland. What do you see happening in terms of momentum gaining and support for the arts through funding?
That's a great question. It really depends. So in my book, I looked at arts funding, in many different cities. There was a great report that was compiled and put out about arts funding, and particularly about equity issues in arts funding. And they found that, we've made, so much progress in certain areas, but we have a long way to go in other areas. And one of those areas is funding for the arts. They looked at the 10 cities in the United States that have the highest amount of funding for the arts. And they found in 9 out of 10 of those cities that the funding was actually getting more, unequal, right? The amount that was going to predominantly white institutions or large institutions instead of community institutions, it was getting like those that have more get more and those that have less get less, basically. So we're going backwards as in general, was what they found. Only in the Bay Area did they find that was not true. And that's because the Bay Area has had a decade of policies in place to specifically address those inequities and to specifically focus on funding art by people of color and art by people that are lower economic, or arts institutions that are smaller and have a smaller budget, but they're doing just as high quality of art as the symphony or something like that. So you have to be intentional, right? I think if you're not intentionally addressing those equity issues, it's only going to magnify, because because the funding apparatus just says, oh, these people are doing, have a $5 million budget. Well, they, deserve, a bigger, portion of funding than these smaller groups. And that's not necessarily true, or at least we have to challenge that thinking. So that was kind of distressing to realize that was the case. We don't have this narrative of progress when we talk about funding, and it has to be done intentionally. And you have to sort of, and if you don't do that, you're going to get, you're not going to get good results, basically.
Yeah. But the issue with intentionality means that sometimes you have to say, we want to do this for Black people.
Yeah.
And then when you say we want to do this for Black people, then the argument comes up, well, that's discrimination, or it's reverse discrimination, or you're showing favoritism, even though if we look at the history of this country, you will see that we're always last in line, and we're always the ones who receive the least. And it just seems that, to use your word, there has to be some intentionality in order to make some correction. The only way that you're going to correct the problem is to deal with it head on. And so in the process, they'll expand the conversation. So instead of saying Black, they'll say people of color. And then when you say people of color, then that means that all these other folks, and it's not to say that they're not deserving, but let's call a spade a spade. I hate to use that phrase, but let's take it head on and let's say these folks have been left out, and let's talk about reparations, because that's part of what this is all about, a restorative process to create the equity that you spoke of. We want to talk a bit more about that when we come back. You're listening to Open Door on 95.9 FM WOVU. This is Vince Robinson. My guests are Macelle Mahala. She's the author of Black Theater, City Life, African American Art Institutions, and Urban Cultural Ecologies, and Mr. Terrence Spivey, my good friend and brother, who is the founding artistic director of Powerful Long Ladder. We'll be back on this Burton Belcar community radio station after this. Welcome back to Open Door with Vince Robinson. I'm speaking with Macelle Mahala. She's written a fantastic book, which will be available to you in the coming weeks. You'll be able to go online. You can pre-order the book by going to the Barnes & Noble website, and we'll give you information on how to do that before this show is over. Mr. Terrence Spivey, who at this moment is in Mobile, Alabama, and he is conducting some workshops and it's like I'm so blessed to have friends that I don't just call them people, I call them movements. This brother went down to Mobile, Alabama, and now they're doing stage productions, and there had been a dearth of that. And now doors are opening, and perhaps we'll see a cultural ecology being built in Mobile. And perhaps this is a model that can be replicated in other cities in this country, because it's important for everybody to have a platform to express their version of reality in a theatrical way. So, Terrence, I don't want to get too far away from what we were just talking about, but I do want to give you an opportunity to talk about what you're doing in Mobile, and then we'll come back to the book.
Yes, I just got a nice note from it posted on Facebook from the legendary Robert Hooks, co-founder Negro Ensemble Company, and became a big star in Hollywood. And he sent a note congratulating me and my co-founder Greg Cyprian on us, continuing to keep Black theater alive. And I put a quote up today on Facebook stating that we can build our own table, even though we're invited to their table, we can still build our own. I'm here. It's been like a year and a half that Clotilda Descendants Association reached out to me. They're the descendants of the ancestors, the African ancestors that was smuggled in 1860 from Dahomey into Mobile Bay, and the ship was burned, tried to, for evidence. And of course, they found the ship still in Mobile Bay and down at the bottom. And I was fortunate, I must say, to get on that boat last February during the time when I was working on a play called An Ocean in My Bones. And we're bringing it back this coming February. But they decided, hey, we want to bring you back. In addition to that, we're going to collaborate with Greg Cyprian, the gentleman that you're looking to work with to build a Black theater company. Here's a non-theater organization collaborating with two theater arts guys to make this happen. They've got integrated into theater now because they need it to use to express and bring their ancestors to life. So I was listening to what y'all talked about earlier about equity and all that. And I'm sitting here, I just had a meeting today with two of the descendants. And I'm like, wow, there's people ready to pour money into their organization for me to even do this play further. They want to take it further. They want it to be part of the destination here in Mobile, for the play itself, in addition to the Africa town where their ancestors had renamed Plateau neighborhood. But they want to help and get it as a destination. So I'm going to be constantly here. I'm working with some actors here who found their song, as August Wilson put, and Joe Turner. They found their song, their own individual song, their own identity. And I'll tell you, yesterday was so spiritual and magical, working on scenes they never seen any plays here. They don't do plays here at all, but they're talented. So I'm here working on that. And at the same time, I'm able to look at the weakness and the strengths of actors that I can work with in the future. Similar to what I did at Caramel when I got there in 2003. I said, okay, let me see who can play, being like the Blacks a Clown show, and who could be in this play down the line. So that's what I've been doing now. And in addition to that, I'm refining the production for next February, doing some scenes. I'm actually bringing some of the playwrights, some of the writers to life who wrote books about Clotilda. But it's been an amazing journey, and they embraced me so well. They brought me in as family, the Descendants. Netflix has Descendant, a documentary that won a special award at Sundance, is going to a Netflix in October. Higher Ground Productions, Obama's production company, they picked it up, and they're looking to have a big screening here in October. And they said, Terrence, are you coming down for that? I'm like, yes, I'll be there.
Yeah.
Yes,
Okay.
but I'm loving it. That merge of they don't know any theater at all, but they do ask me, Terrence, is this right? They trust me. We know an art is also about trust. It's
Yes.
also about trust. So they're embracing me well. I'm loving it.
So you mentioned their willingness to support it, and we were talking about funding just a few moments ago. Macelle, I wanted to ask you, you mentioned that there were 10 cities that I guess they're doing it right. Can you mention what some of those cities are? I know maybe you don't know all 10, but can you give us an indication of what they are and what they're doing?
Well, the report was on 10 cities, but it was actually only San Francisco that had any kind of progress in terms of equity in its philanthropy and arts funding out of those 10 cities. So what San Francisco did right was the San Francisco Arts Commission has specifically in their mission, a directive to look at equity issues, racial equity, economic equity, issues that have to do with displacement. If there are small companies that they're in danger of losing their lease or something, things like that. So the reason that San Francisco and the Bay Area have made progress is because they wanted to make progress, first of all, and they put that into their mission in terms of the arts funding, at least at the city level.
Okay. Do you see this as a possible way that multiple cities can do similar things? Do you see any kind of momentum building, or are we still looking at the silo situation where you got a pocket here, a pocket there, and a couple of other places?
No, I think there's a lot of room for collaboration, and there's also, part of the book is giving these 4 examples from these 4 different cities, and what might work in one place might not work in another place. So for me, looking at these 4 cities in the Bay Area, it was the fact that the city owned these art centers, and they provided those centers for use to the community. So the rents weren't so high. So that enabled the theater to be able to survive some of this displacement and these astronomical rising costs. In Cleveland, you have the history of Karamu, and you have over 100 years of support and philanthropy for that particular institution. Not that institution hasn't faced challenges, but there's I think a respect and a reverence for the longevity of that particular theater company that's unique. I can't think of any other theater company that was started in 1915 that still exists today, right? Langston Hughes. When I looked at the history of Karamu, I really enjoyed looking at Langston Hughes' association with the theater and how he felt nurtured. He attended Karamu programming as a teenager, and he felt nurtured by that group of people, and he felt like giving back to that institution because of that. So that was wonderful to learn about through my research and to write about in the book. In Pittsburgh, it's taking August Wilson's international renown, and using that as a tool to build and to support theater, right? In Atlanta, I loved going to Atlanta, and I love the theater companies in Atlanta, being part of that community that's so tied to the civil rights movement, and that's such a powerhouse of Black leadership and power and spirit, and using that and honoring that. So I think it really depends on the place, and what are the strengths? What are your strengths as a community, and how do you build on that?
Okay.
That's, yeah.
I know that the pandemic had a major impact on art and culture in this community. At a certain point, we received funding through the CARES Act, and there were disbursements that were made to people who were in different artistic categories. I'm just wondering, from your perspective, being in California, what the impact was out there. Did it suffer as much as it did in other places in light of the funding and the philanthropy that exists in that world?
Yeah, I would say definitely. I mean, theater, it's the beauty of theater, right? You need people there, and it's also the vulnerability, right? If you can't get together, if you can't get people in there, if people don't feel comfortable, then you're losing money. It's hard to come back from that. So I think that's been true everywhere. Things just stopped, and the income just stopped, and the CARES Act that helps some, but it's a huge challenge. So that was sort of, I don't cover that in my book because my book ended right before the pandemic began, but I can see that just from looking at theater production now. It's just starting to come back, right? Mm-hmm. And it's still not at the level that it was at before the pandemic.
Okay, Terrence, I want to ask you at this point, you're in this process of collaboration, and I can see you duplicating what you're doing in Mobile, possibly in other cities. Do you see this momentum as being something that can be carried forward to other places?
Oh yeah, definitely. Here again, I think if others are paying attention, like watching what other theaters are doing, it kind of reminded me of, I hate to put it this way, on how Caramel was in terms of during the Black Arts Movement, when unfortunately they had to let the Silvers go, but but how it went around, and it went around about all the theaters that we want to have our own, but the whole Black Arts Movement situation. That's what I'm sensing, even particularly for the during the pandemic. After that, for the George Floyd, like she mentioned about Caramel's production, and other organizations I'm seeing now a lot of more social justice pieces being done. Even some of the funders are actually giving money out to some of the theaters to put them up. So I think with particularly what I'm doing here, I'm hoping it'd be a template. I'm hoping it'd be a template in terms of not just theaters, but organizations like Clotilda the Citizens Association would join forces to bring reality to the stage like their ancestors. But I feel it's like that Black Arts Movement, the riots or the protests, and folks are beginning to say, hey, we have to do some works that reflects up on the stage. I just want to say quickly, though, I didn't get a chance at the beginning, my fault, but Macelle, I'd like to just thank you. It was an honor that you reached out to me and talked to me about Caramel, because I would talk for hours. But I just want to thank you so much for reaching out. Thank you so much for reaching out. I don't know if I can ask this question, Vince, what other Black theater books are out now? Because I know back in the 60s and 70s, you had books out. You had an anthology of plays by Paul Carter Harrison, Woody King, even my two mentors, James Lee Hatch, the Black Theater USA, and my former teacher at Prairie View, Ted Shine, the late Ted Shine. So I don't see that many books. I was so excited when you called and said you were doing something on, the Black theater, because I don't know anything out now, even before you and even after you, that's just really following what the Black theaters are doing.
I want to just say thank you, Terrence, and send that honor and appreciation back to you. I have learned this. Writing the book was this was the best part, was talking to people like yourself, and hearing these stories and sharing them. That's really the best part of it for me as an author. It's just incredibly gratifying and educational and uplifting. So thank you. So I'm going to send the thanks back to you.
Thank you.
In terms of, I'll share a little story. When I was writing my first book on Penumbra, I went to a writing workshop for young academics, which I was at the time. And someone said, you're not going to be able to get this book published because nobody wants to read about theater companies, right? So there are books about, specific actors or, topics or, anthologies of plays, but they were just like, nobody is going to publish this because just focusing on one company is not gonna, nobody's gonna care about that. But I thought that they would. And why I think it's interesting to write about institutions is because it's, maybe it goes back to my theater background. I think that the communal, the collaborative effort is important, and it's important to acknowledge and talk about. It's not just the director, it's not just the actor, it's not just the audience member, it's everybody together making this beautiful thing, right? So I wanted to write a book that really talked about, like, these institutions are important because they're groups of people that are working together to do something special. So I just ignored that person, and I did get my book published, and it went well. And now I've got the second book published. So that was some good advice. And sometimes you just ignore people if they're coming from a different place. So that communal, that communal thing is what's really important. And, these institutions are also really important, and all the people that are part of these institutions. And you kind of lose that if you don't look at it, broadly like that. So there are some, when my first book came out, there was not that many. I think I could count on, one hand how many books had been published about Black theater companies. There were not that many. Now there are more. Since then there have been, several other ones. One of the people that I looked at as a model, Sandra Mayo, she's from Texas. So Terrence, you might appreciate this. She published 2 books. She published one anthology of plays by Black Texans, and then she published another book that was about Black theater companies in Texas. And that was, both of those books are really great. And, she used that expression, making a way out of no way, to really talk about those folks and those theater companies and, what they were able to accomplish. So there are books out there. There are more than there used to be. There could be more. Harvey Young's collection, he has an oral history, like an interview with artists from Chicago. So it's not looking at theater companies, but it's like a big book of interviews with Black theater artists from Chicago. And that's a great book as well. So there are some books that have been published, fairly recently that are, adding to that canon.
Okay. Well, your book is City Life, African American Arts Institutions and Urban Cultural Ecologies, and we are looking forward to the publishing of this book, and hopefully others will be written. We're going to talk a bit more about the book and a few other things when we come back. This is Open Door with Vince Robinson on 95.9 FM WOVU. Back in a moment. Welcome back to Open Door with Vince Robinson. My guests this morning are Macelle Mahala, author of Black Theater, City Life, African American Art Institutions and Urban Cultural Ecologies, and Terrence Spivey, the founding artistic director of Powerful Long Ladder. So we've covered a lot of ground. Macelle, are you thinking of writing another book yet?
Not right now, no. I'm working on a couple of essays that will be in anthologies, but I'm not starting a whole nother book yet. I need a little break, I think.
Okay. So I know you do more than writing. You mentioned that you're out in California. What other kinds of things are you doing?
I'm a professor, so I teach classes. I work as a dramaturg, so I worked with my mentor, Lou Bellamy, on a show in Southern California, I think in February or March. So a dramaturg is kind of a strange role in theater. So it's the person that kind of does research. So for August Wilson plays, you might look up, historical details. What did Pittsburgh look like in the 1940s? And you could bring, pictures of the Hill in the 1940s into the rehearsal room. If you are we just worked on a Pearl Clegg play, What I Learned in Paris. And some of that was influenced by, she worked on Maynard Jackson's campaign in Atlanta. And so some of the plot was about that. And it was set when Maynard Jackson was elected mayor of Atlanta. So I did a lot of research about that. I read her memoir where she talked about working in his administration. And then I, brought that into the rehearsal room. So I do things like that in terms of theater production.
Okay. I'm just curious, after having had this conversation with you, what steered you towards your interest in theater?
I was always interested in theater. I think when I was, maybe 5 or 6, the high school was doing a production of The Wizard of Oz, and they were having like the local kids, be the munchkins. So I think that was my first experience with theater, was that I was a munchkin in The Wizard of Oz. So I've always loved theater ever since then. And this is just, the latest manifestation of it.
Okay. This question is actually for both of you. What do you see in terms of the intersectionality between theater and other cultural things, such as music and visual art and so forth and so on? What do you see as the intersection between these various art forms?
Well, I've worked on something that had that connection. 2009, I did a piece by Thomas Gibbons called Permanent Collection. He wrote B. Luther Hatchie. It dealt about a true story about this gallery director in Philadelphia, and we ended up, we had an arena theater, and the owner, this fictional character based on a real life gallery owner in Philadelphia. He's a ghost that follows around the gallery. And we actually had paintings on the floor of the lily pads and all these different, from Matisse and Picasso, and we had empty frames in the ceiling. And then we also had Vince, you know the gentleman's name. He lives off Euclid. He has a bed and breakfast.
Ed Parker.
Yes, we had some of his works in the lobby of Caramoo, where people could go in and see the gallery of works, that they could come see the play. That was in 2009. It was so fulfilling because just seeing the marriage of all the disciplines, it felt so fulfilling. We had talkbacks, and we also had a cross-pollination of theater lovers and art lovers that came to see the play.
Okay. Well, one of the reasons that I even had the thought about that question was just looking at Pittsburgh. In Pittsburgh, you got August Wilson, but then you have George Benson, you got Ahmad Jamal. I mean, you got all these jazz artists. When I look at Cleveland and I look at some of the musicians who have done work in Caramoo and other venues, you got Dr. David Thomas, you got Ed Ridley, you got all these wonderful musicians. So they come in, and then you look at Caramoo as a place for art. I've been privileged to have a solo exhibition up at Caramoo. So it's like you got this one place and all these things come together. And so when you talk about an ecology, and when you talk about the economic impact that art has on a community, we struggle when we talk about funding, because when people hear the dollars are coming, for whatever reason, they have all these concerns about public safety. Their answer to everything is to put more cops on the street. But then when you look at the role of art in our lives and the healing that it facilitates and the way that it brings things together, I mean, when you turn the lights down in the theater and the lights come up on the stage, you know, you got white people, you got black people, everybody is in there in that immersive experience, seeing reality being depicted right in front of them. So, you know, we should have more funding for the arts. And I don't want to open up this can of worms about defunding the police, because you understand why. But I mean, we really do need to start thinking about ways that we can provide support for those who create and facilitate healing in our communities. The playwrights are, the directors are, the artists, the actors, the musicians, all of us have a role to play in that.
Yes.
Macelle, when you hear statements like that, what are your thoughts about what the future of art and culture look like in this country?
Well, I agree 100%. The arts are transformational. They're vital. They're not, you know, I don't view them as extra. So I think one of the things that I wish we had more of was more arts education in the schools. And that's something that has diminished even since I was a child, right? Where you have not as much arts education, not as much money for field trips. I remember going to Penumbra when I was in high school on a field trip and just being amazed. There was the production was A Raisin in the Sun. And I remember sitting in the audience in the auditorium, and the lights came up. They had the lights like simulating, you know, sunrise. And they actually were cooking the breakfast backstage, so you could smell you could smell the bacon, you know, being cooked, you know, and Ruth comes out with the breakfast and Travis is on the couch there. And I just thought, wow, you know, it just changed my life seeing that production. And I wish that more young people would have that experience, and, you know, we would have, you know, funding in our K through 12 to give students those kinds of experiences. And sometimes we do, and sometimes we don't. So that's what I would say. I would say, yeah, I'm also an educator, and, you know, I think arts education, we need more support for that. And then, you know, professional art as well. And those things are related.
Okay. Well, on that note, we're going to express our hope for the future of art and culture and education. We want to thank you for writing such a fine publication. It is, once again, Black Theater, City Life, African American Art Institutions, and Urban Cultural Ecologies. It will be available on barnesandnoble.com. I'm sure it'll probably be on Amazon and all the other platforms in which they sell books. But much success to you and your endeavors with regard to that publication. And to my friend Terrence Spivey, keep doing what you're doing, brother. You know, you're making noise, and you ain't like James Brown, you know, say talking loud and saying nothing. He's talking loud and he's saying something. So thank you for what you do. And thank you all for joining me on Open Door. As always, know yourself, love yourself, be yourself, make today your best day. Peace.